Today, I'd like to talk about something I'm calling the Art Historians Macroscope. I'm going to talk about it in a few ways. One, what on earth do I mean by this, and why do art historians in particular need it? I'm going to show an example of how I'm using this in my own research, and I'll finish up, kind of like the last panelist, with a few thoughts on what this might mean for the future of museums and academic art historians working together. What is a macroscope? I'm stealing this wholeheartedly from Joël de Ronet, who in 1979 used this term sort of as a counterpart. We have the telescope that looks at the infinitely great, and the microscope, which looks at the infinitely small. These are physical instruments. The macroscope he called a symbolic instrument. This was sort of a bouquet of theories and methods that are used to distill patterns from complexity. Now, more recently, these ideas are really coming into the foreground in a lot of humanities research. My sort of proximate source is this really great book project, The Historians Macroscope, by Sean Graham, Ian Milligan, and Scott Weingart. What I really like about what they're doing is they take this idea of using data analysis, big data. If you hate that term as much as I do, that's nice. But what I like about what they do is they see it as one tool in the tool belt that works best in conjunction with what we might otherwise call traditional methods of history and research. So why does this matter for art historians? Well, there's actually an argument, I think, to be made that data analysis isn't really new to art history. Way back in 1708, Roger de Piel actually tried his hand at quantifying stylistic features of old master artists. So this is something that's been around for a long time. But we're reaching an interesting point, nexus, where the computer methods are becoming accessible enough, and the museum data is becoming accessible enough that it's, I think, going to begin profoundly affecting academic research. And it's not going to help art historians address this real long-standing tension we've had in our field. We pride ourselves on close looking, this considering of a particular object or a particular artist from all the angles. And I mean that literally, yes, visually, all the angles, but also its material history, its technical and material aspects, its social history, its iconographic history, even its philosophical status. This is really important and will always be very important to art history. But we also have a problem of scale. And especially if you're someone like me who researches prints, we have an enormous number of prints, even if you're dating back into the 16th century. This is a huge challenge. It's very hard for us to claim that we have sort of a synthetic understanding of Dutch printmaking from this period when our book can really perhaps only consider 50, maybe 100 etchings or engravings at a time. So how do we deal with this? Well, how can we honor the specificity of individual artists and artworks while also honoring the complexity of the structures that they operated within? Well, this is where museum data comes to the rescue. We've sort of gotten an inkling of this idea already in some of the earlier talks, and especially, Dana, your introduction. Museums are repositories of artworks, yes, but also repositories of knowledge, curatorial knowledge, research into the objects they hold. This has been being put into internal databases for decades now, but it's only just beginning to make its way out into the public sphere. And this is, I think, going to really change our research. One of the finest examples of this, I think, is found at the British Museum. They've described their collections as linked open data using something called the CDOC conceptual reference model. What it means is that they have thought very carefully about how their objects interact with people, with places, with events, and with concepts. And they've released this data in such a way that it's possible to get really detailed information, the kind of narratives about objects that you might only get maybe in a curatorial essay. You can now get as structured information that you can compute. So take prints. My project, I'm really interested in them as collaborative artworks, right? You will often have an artist who makes a design for a print, a professional plate gutter, either an engraver or an etcher, whose job it is to actually make this design into a design that's on the metal plate. And very frequently, you'll even have a third actor in this whole scheme, a publisher, who will print these impressions and market them. These prints, in addition to being beautiful artworks, can also become like an index of a social relationship at a certain point in time. What happens if we take 50,000 or more of these prints and begin to think about all of these relationships together? This kind of data is a perfect candidate for formal network analysis. Because we have so many dated prints, it's possible to actually construct a dynamic representation of this printmaking network. And this is just a little static visualization. You've probably seen this before, maybe on Facebook, the spaghetti graph. Don't worry, you don't actually get real information from this, but it does look pretty. If we actually delve into the statistics behind this network, we can actually start to trace the structure of the network itself and the positions of the individuals within it. And this is really exciting for me as an art historian because we get to ask questions that, well, we couldn't really ask them before. They didn't even make sense before. For example, I kind of got curious in this idea, well, were certain regional networks in printmaking in Europe, at what points did they, were they very centralized? Did you have a sort of like a star network with a bunch of people coming in, always connecting to some certain prominent individuals? Or when did they become more distributed? Perhaps as more local print centers arose as the economy grew and grew, especially in the Netherlands. We can now trace this using this index of social relationships that we've inferred from these prints. And it gets very interesting, to try and ask, well, what's different about a Dutch artist, follow that red line there, trying to break into this market, say in 1600, highly centralized, versus in 1650 or 1700, when it's become relatively much more distributed. What does this mean for the individual? And this is also leading us to new questions about individuals' places in these networks. One interesting thing, printmaking networks are a lot like a huge number of social networks and biological networks that we find in the real world. A vast majority of the actors only make one or two connections in their lives. It's only a very small minority that are actually very highly connected. You can see in this visualization that's what some of them would look like. Who sits at these central positions is a really exciting question for art historians. Now, some of these names are not too surprising for us. We have really prominent publishers like Klaus Fischer and, of course, Rembrandt, very important to printmaking. But we also have some surprises. Jonas Sauterhoff, if you haven't heard of him, you're not alone. The last book made on him was done in 1861. Who is this guy, and why is he so important to Dutch printmaking in the 1630s? How is he so central, and art historians have barely done any work on him? Well, you start to look actually at the objects that he worked on, and he was everywhere. He was doing Italianate landscapes after Nicholas Berchem. He was doing peasant scenes after Adrian van Ostade. He was doing scenes after Peter Paul Rubens, this real artistic polymath. He did refined group portraits after Gerard ter Borch, the signing of the Treaty of Munster for you European history buffs. And he even did these vivacious single-figure reproductions after paintings by Frans Hals. Why haven't we had exhibitions of this guy? Well, in part, there's an easy answer to that. These are very workmanlike prints. Artistically, they're not really that impressive. But if we ignore him because he's not artistically impressive, we miss out on a really big part of the story of printmaking at that time. This synthetic conception we thought we had of Dutch printmaking has holes in it. And so moving from this sort of view at 30,000 feet of this whole entire network, we can begin to drill down and actually find new stories about individual artists that really need to change the way that we think about printmaking at this time. So to finish up, how can we encourage more art historians, because I'd love for there to be more than just me, working on these types of questions? Well, it's sort of a two-sided coin, because we have museums and universities that are working on this. Museums can do some great things, which again, we've heard a lot about. Document more knowledge. Don't just put the tombstone information out there, who's the artist and the date and so forth. Curators have a lot of information about these objects. The more that we can put out online in a structured format that we can compute over, the better. Another one, again, we've heard a little bit of this. Digital doesn't just mean website only. I don't know if we have any museum directors in here. Probably not, but that would be a good lesson to take home. From top to bottom, the way that you structure your data internally in the museum and release it outwards, that's going to completely affect how it gets used. Can it only be used in a mobile app, or can it be used by academic researchers as well for some of these kind of crazy questions? Third, and this is a really hard one, it would be great if these data was more interoperable between museums. Museums are used to collaborating on exhibitions, but if you can collaborate on data as well, how to express this, how to communicate it, then it makes my job a lot easier in trying to understand and incorporate far more collections. But that's a really hard one if you talk to the professionals, and we'll hear a bit more about that too. There's also work to be done on the museum side, just to finish up. As art historians, we need to remember our data-driven roots. We've done this work a lot. We haven't really called it as such, but we shouldn't be scared about trying some of these quantitative processes again in our research, mostly because it's going to let us test our art historical ideas really creatively. We can actually begin to do quasi-scientific hypothesis testing and inferencing over this data, and combine that with some of the interpretive work that we're really already very good at. Third thing is to remember our priorities as humanists, or digital humanists, if you want to call it that, they may be different than those at the museum. Museums have been doing digital work for a very long time, and we need to understand how to navigate this relationship between these two art histories, as it's sometimes been called. So thank you very much. That's my clarion call.